Hello, in this video, we want to finish um, the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, which is also the Deuteronomistic history. And we want to do a brief comparison with First and Second Chronicles. First and Second Chronicles in the Jewish Bible are in the third part, the writings. They are post-exilic. They are some of the latest books of the Old Testament. And they give, between First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, we get an interesting contrast of perspective. Because First and Second Kings, even though they were written up during the exile, so the exile begins 586 BC, and it's fairly clear because of where Second Kings ends, that First Second Kings would have been written up during the exile, probably. Could have been after the exile even, but let's say that First and Second Kings were written as we watch the kingdom disappear. Israel's gone into exile. The intelligentsia. So you never want to be the important person when a foreign country takes over, because the important people are taken off to Rome and slaughtered. The poor person might actually survive an overtake of the government because they're not important enough to kill. They just go to work for the new empire or whatever. But so First and Second Kings probably were edited in the wake of the destruction of Jerusalem in the 500s, and so they give us a perspective of the monarchy. They give us a Israelite perspective before the fall. They give us, as it were, a looking back perspective. But First and Second Chronicles, they were written probably in the 400s, maybe even the late 400s, back probably about the time when Israel is being reconstituted as a political entity. Now, Israel is still under the control of the Persians in the 400s, and so it's not like they're free. But First and Second Chronicles probably relate. Ezra, Nehemiah, First, Second Chronicles, they all go together. They are, as it were, the position statement of the new Israel under the Persians. And so we get interesting tensions between these two. It's not that they contradict each other, but we get two unique, kind of like with the Gospels, you get unique emphases and unique perspectives with First, Second Kings, which look back to the time of the monarchy, and are of that same flavor, and Chronicles, which is of the time of the Persian Israel in the Persian period. I don't know if that made any sense, but hopefully it will before we get through all of this. So, First Kings. David has just died, and so as we begin First Kings, Solomon, the son of David, becomes king. Now, to us, it's obvious that Solomon should be the heir to David. I learned that in Sunday school, right? But there were other contenders. And Solomon wasn't necessarily the lead contender after David died, but as I remember, David's mother, uses this is where a mother comes in handy. That the politics of the moment end up with Solomon as king, and he has some older brothers from other wives of David, but Solomon, the son of Bathsheba, becomes the favored son, and David chooses him in his final days as king. And of course, David says, I promised some people I wouldn't kill them, but you haven't promised them. And so this is a little, dastardly on David's part. He has Solomon do away with some of the people that David promised he wouldn't. And so, I think a little less of David, frankly, as I read the first few chapters of First Kings. Solomon asks for wisdom. Now, it is interesting because in Chronicles, Solomon comes out cleaner than he is in Kings. Kings is not as positive towards Solomon as Chronicles is. And in fact, when we read about Solomon in the book of Kings, we wonder whether he'll even be in heaven in the kingdom of God. He worships other gods. He marries wives from other countries that worship other gods. In fact, when you read I think it's Deuteronomy 18 that talks about a prophet like Moses. That sounds an awful lot to me like Josiah, we will see is a really good king. Solomon, it almost sounds like Deuteronomy 18 is describing the ante of Solomon. Solomon does all the things that you're not supposed to do as a good king. Very interesting. And so I'm not sure that Solomon is a particularly good king. I mean, I grew up with the Chronicles view of Solomon. I learned the Chronicles view of Solomon growing up in Sunday school, but the King's version of Solomon is not real great, to be honest. I mean, so much so that you wonder whether Solomon, he got wisdom, yes, but not everybody who's really smart does the right thing. It's a bit of a conundrum for me, because God gives Solomon wisdom, but the wisdom, he doesn't seem so wise. In fact, there are a lot of fools that seem wiser than Solomon in some respects, given the way, I mean, he does some things that are politically smart, making alliances. But anyway, that's something you can wrestle with as you read the account of well, actually, I'm not requiring you to read the account of Solomon, but next time you read First Kings and Chronicles, you might keep that in mind, the contrast there. Solomon builds the first temple. One of the interesting things about Chronicles is, in Chronicles, David plans it. So David wants to build the temple in Chronicles, but God doesn't let him. And so it's Solomon that actually builds it. And of course, Solomon is the one that builds the temple in both Kings and Chronicles. But in Chronicles, David wants to, and David asks, and the Lord says no, and David designs it. So that's an interesting difference between Kings and Chronicles. Under David, under Saul, and under David, and under Solomon, under those three kings, there is a unified Israel. Both the north and south are under Saul's rule, under David's rule, and then under Solomon's rule. So we have a unified kingdom for a short period of time of these three kings' rule. Now, after Solomon dies, apparently Solomon was a rather hard taskmaster. Solomon apparently was very demanding. And of course, this is exactly what Samuel warns. And it's very interesting. We find that Solomon does exactly what Samuel tells them he'll do. He'll tax you, he'll build things, and so Solomon was a really hard king. I mean, we celebrate all the great things he built. By the way, I've noticed that this is not true at Houghton College, but I've tracked some other at least one other college, and I've noticed that when that other college has building programs, that seems to be it for the president. That in a number of cases, after a major building program, the president resigns or retires. I'm not saying that it might be just a coincidence, but a lot of times when we look back in history, we think, oh, this was a great president, or this was a great leader. They build all kinds of things, but it's not so nice for the people who do all the work under them. Anyway, with regard to Solomon, this is the case. So glorious Solomon builds all these things, builds the temple. But from the people perspective, a guy named Jeroboam comes to King Rehoboam. Rehoboam is Solomon's son. And Jeroboam says, now I don't know that Jeroboam's sincere, but Jeroboam comes to Rehoboam and says, your father was pretty hard on us. We're willing to serve you, Rehoboam, but only if you'll lighten up a little bit. And Rehoboam goes to two groups of people. And there's also a moral of this story as well. Rehoboam goes to the older advisors, and he goes to his young friends, his college buddies. And the older people say, you better listen to what Jeroboam is saying and go a little lighter. Say you're going to be a little lighter. And his young college buddies say, tell him you're going to be even harder on him. You're going to, my father was nothing. Wait till you see me, And if the lesson is, of course, listen to your elders. That's the moral. There's a moral to that story there. Rehoboam listens to his younger buddies. He says to Jeroboam, my father's thigh is the size of my pinky. There may be other meanings to that metaphor, but I'm not going to tell you. But anyway, he basically says, you thought my father was hard, I'm going to be even harder. And Jeroboam says, fine, see ya. And immediately the country splits. Rehoboam is only left with two of the tribes in the south and Jeroboam becomes the king of the now much larger northern kingdom. And from this point on, the southern kingdom is called Judah, from which we get the word Jew. And then the northern kingdom is what is called Israel from this point on. So we now have a divided monarchy. We have two kingdoms from this point on. The kings of the north are all evil. And of course, from the standpoint of the book of Deuteronomy, we would expect this to be the case because the temple, the place where God's name is in Jerusalem in the south. And so because none of the kings of the north worship at Jerusalem, they can't be good kings. Of course, there's also the question of history being told by the winners. The northern kingdom was destroyed in 722. I have that on the next slide. The northern kingdom was destroyed in 722 BC by the Assyrians, and so they're not around to tell their version of the story. But from the biblical standpoint and from the standpoint of Judah, none of the kings of the north were good. They were all evil. That none of them worshipped at the right place. None of them worshipped in Jerusalem. Now, the kings of the south aren't all good, but they're mixed. Some of the kings of the south are good. Some of the kings of the south in Judah are not good. It kind of depends, but at least some of the kings of the south are good. Elijah is the prophet of the north, and we hear a lot about Elijah in the books of First Kings. In the book of First Kings, Elijah he brings water after a drought. He kills prophets of Baal. He hides himself in a cave. He's like, poor me, I'm the only one left. And God says, you're not. I've got 700 people who haven't bowed to Baal. And so lots of great stories. By the way, some of the miracles of Jesus echo miracles that Elijah the prophet did. And some people think that Jesus may be Elijah in the Gospels. Okay, 2 Kings. 2 Kings begins with Elijah ascending to heaven. There are two people in the Old Testament who are said not to have died, never to have died. One is Elijah, who goes up to heaven in a fiery chariot, and the other is a guy named Enoch, who is, I think, the grandfather of Noah, or maybe the great grandfather of Noah. But Enoch doesn't die in Genesis. So there are two people. This might be a test question. There are two people who don't die in the Bible. One of them is Elijah, who ascends to heaven, and the other is Enoch. So that's interesting, right? As Elijah is leaving, Elisha, his mentee, his apprentice, asks if he can have a portion of Elijah's glory, and Elijah gives him his mantle. So we talk about passing on the mantle. That's the kind of metaphor we use when we're talking about passing leadership from one person to the next. You pass on the mantle of leadership. Elisha also performs Jesus-like miracles. Jesus' ministry echoes these two figures. He stays with a widow. He raises a child from the dead. He heals a leper. Again, there's a intertextuality between the miracles of Jesus and the miracles of these two prophets in the northern kingdom. Again, these prophets in the northern kingdom offer sacrifices in places they're not supposed to. Clearly in Kings, they are endorsed as good prophets, as the Lord's prophets, and yet they're in violation of Deuteronomy. And so again, I've been working on this theme that we know more than they did in many respects about God, because we have scripture, and they apparently did not. The northern kingdom, okay, hold on a second. There we are. The northern kingdom is destroyed in 722 BC. And this is a date I want you to know. I don't require a lot of dates. I would like you to know that Abraham lived about 1800 or 2000 BC. I would like you to know that David lived about 1000 BC. I would like you to know the two dates that are suggested for the Exodus in the 1200s BC and the 1400s BC, one of those two. These are like multiple choice things to know. I would like you to know that the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, was destroyed in 722 BC. And I would like you to know that they were destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire was centered in Nineveh, which of course is a parallel with Jonah. The book of Jonah becomes all the more interesting when we realize that the Assyrian Empire of Jonah is the empire that will end up destroying the northern kingdom. Jonah is not wrong. for hating Assyria. Of course, it hasn't happened yet at the time of Jonah. That's also important. The readers of Jonah know, I think the readers of Jonah know that Assyria will go on to destroy the northern kingdom. And that makes Jonah even all the more meaningful, because the book of Jonah is basically saying God was willing to forgive even Nineveh when they were repentant. Jonah, on the other hand, from the northern kingdom, even though he had reason to be angry with Assyria, is in the wrong in the book of Jonah. It's all very, very meaningful. But anyway, the Assyria, Nineveh was about where Mosul is in Iraq. The northern part of Iraq is where Nineveh was, right near there. I was very afraid during the Iraq War that Nineveh, the ruins of Nineveh, would be destroyed by bombing, but thankfully it wasn't. The northern kingdom was destroyed in 722 BC by Assyria in the north. But Hezekiah, this is Hezekiah's tunnel behind me, when Sennacherib, I told this story in the previous video, that when Sennacherib's army, Assyrian army, came, Hezekiah was able to wait them out because he had the Siloam tunnel access to water that saved the day. And Sennacherib just went on. He says in his annals, as I said, I shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, but that's all he can say. He's not able to have victory. Hezekiah, there's a fun story, I don't know what fun, interesting story in Chronicles about Hezekiah asking the Lord to be saved from death. And the Lord gives Hezekiah 15 extra years. Well, what we know is that it was during that 15 years that Manasseh was born. And Manasseh will prove to be the most evil of all of the kings of the southern kingdom. And in fact, according to the Bible, it's because of the sins of Manasseh that the southern kingdom will eventually go into captivity in another date, I want you to know, 586 BC. But hold that thought for a second. Manasseh's son, if Manasseh's according to Kings, Manasseh is the worst of all the southern kings. And according to 2 Kings, Josiah, his son, is the best of all the kings. And so we have a lot of irony here because Josiah will die young in battle. Manasseh, the worst of the kings, will live out a long, long reign and die peacefully in bed. You know, this actually goes against Deuteronomistic theology. It's deeply ironic. Josiah, the best king, surely should have had the best rule, but he dies in battle. Manasseh, who is the worst king, should have surely had a short life, which we have to also remember that we're still living in the time when the sins of the fathers are visited on the sons. And so even though Josiah is good, he has the inheritance of his father's evil. And the book of Kings says that even though Josiah was good, he was not able to overcome the evil of Manasseh. That according to 2 Kings, God makes up his mind that because of Manasseh, he is going to let the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem. So the Babylonians destroy so you have the Assyrians destroy the northern kingdom, the Babylonians destroy Assyria, and then the Babylonians destroy the southern kingdom and Jerusalem. That'll take place in 586 BC. So Manasseh, it is because of the sins of Manasseh, even though he dies peacefully in bed after a long reign, it is the sins of Manasseh, according to 2 Kings, that ultimately bring about the destruction of Jerusalem and the southern kingdom. In fact, there's a saying, we're going to encounter this saying when we get to the prophets. Our fathers are the ones that ate the sour grapes, but it's our teeth that hurt. And this is something that Israel will wrestle with in Ezekiel and Jeremiah. So Manasseh is the worst king. Hezekiah is a good king, by the way. Hezekiah is one of the best kings. And Josiah, according to the perspective of 2 Kings, is the best of all the southern kings. Why? Because he not only tears down other gods, but he and Hezekiah are the ones that really require sacrifices only to be offered in the Jerusalem temple. So throughout the kingdom of Israel and Judah, you have Elisha, you have Elijah offering sacrifices. They're to Yahweh, but they're offering them all over the place. But after Hezekiah and Josiah, only in the temple in Jerusalem. That's the only place where you can offer sacrifices to Yahweh in all of Israel after Josiah becomes king. And of course, it's during the reign of Josiah that the book of the law is found in the temple. I've argued that this is the book of Deuteronomy because the book of Deuteronomy calls itself the book of the law. And Joshua, I think, thereafter calls Deuteronomy the book of the law. So again, it's like, what is this? The priest comes, the high priest comes to Josiah and says, "We have found the book of the law." And Josiah says, "Oh, good. What's that?" And it's like nobody even knows. And when Josiah realizes that they haven't been doing this stuff, he's like, "We've got to start doing this stuff." And there's this great revival under the reign of Josiah. By the way, they take it to a prophetess, a prophetess named Huldah. There's a woman. It's a woman. So it's funny. The high priest, you would have thought that the high priest was the number one spiritual authority in Israel, but the high priest takes the book of the law to Huldah. And so Huldah is the number one spiritual authority in all of Israel. Again, this is like Deborah, that there is precedence in the Bible for a woman being the senior spiritual voice. The Old Testament knows nothing about women not being able to be ministers. Now, it's not typical in the Old Testament, but it's very clear that there is a space within the theology of the Old Testament for a woman to be the senior political leader and for a woman to be the senior spiritual leader. And the New Testament doesn't close that down. If anything, the New Testament opens it up, as I said, because of Acts 2, where it says your sons and your daughters will prophesy. And so we'll talk about that more than when we get to the New Testament. But it's very interesting to me that when the high priest wants to know if something is from God, he takes it to this woman, this prophetess, Huldah, and she verifies it. Here's the other date that from this video that you need to know. Again, for a multiple choice, you need to know that the destruction of Jerusalem takes place in 586 BC. This is when the Babylonians now come and they destroy Jerusalem and they destroy the temple. All right, that was 1st and 2nd Kings. So 1st and 2nd Kings, I mean, again, I think it was already being written in the days of Josiah. I think 1st and 2nd Kings, I mean, the whole Deuteronomistic history, I think, was mostly done probably. I would guess that the Deuteronomistic history of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, that all was mostly done in the days of Josiah and the 50 years thereafter. So that 2nd Kings ends with the destruction of Jerusalem, I believe, or at least with the kind of the closing days. And so the Deuteronomistic history, as we now have it, reached something like its current form in the early 500s BC, I would say. The Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, come from much later, well, maybe the 400s, perhaps mid 400s to late 400s, around the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, and so forth, that the Chronicles give us a perspective on the history of Israel from that later stance, from that post-exilic, post-exile. It's a later perspective. So, for example, as I mentioned, we now understand that there is this Satan, and we'll learn more about Satan, the adversary, when we get to Job. But I do want to here briefly point out that this is very revealing to me. There are two passages. So 2 Kings 24:1 says, God put it in the heart of David to number the children of Israel. He takes a census he's not supposed to take. So this is God tempting David to do evil, which we know from James 1, God doesn't do. God doesn't tempt anyone with evil. And so that's like, what's going on here? It's kind of like in Samuel, where God sends an evil spirit on Saul. What? God doesn't do that. What's interesting is when we go to 1 Chronicles 21:1, it says that Satan put it in the heart of David to number the children of Israel. Very interesting. 2 Samuel 24, God put it in the heart of David to number the children of Israel. 1 Chronicles 21, Satan put it in the heart of David to number the children of Israel. So Chronicles says that Satan did something that King says God did. And so the way I harmonize this is that, well, it's true. Everything that happens by God's approval. God signs off on everything. God is sovereign. Nothing happens without God allowing it to happen. But we can make a distinction between the directive will of God. This is where God directly directs something, he commands it directly, and the permissive will of God. This is where God allows something to happen, something that may not be his ideal, but he allows it for a greater purpose. And so underneath God, you have these other spiritual agents, and even human agents. You have human agents like Hitler. Did God allow Hitler to kill 6 million Jews? Yes, God signs off on everything. God allowed Hitler to kill 6 million Jews for some greater purpose that we don't necessarily know. We know that God is good. He allows bad things to happen, but we have to assume that if we could see the big picture, we would know that God is good, and there's a good reason for God doing this. But God allows Hitlers to do bad things. In the same way, God allows Satan to do things, as we see in Job. And so I would synthesize it this way. God allowed Satan to put it in the heart of David to number the children of Israel, to where God is not directly doing it, but that God is allowing Satan to do it. And so this harmonizes these two theologically. In Second Samuel, in Second Kings, we only have, or is it Second Samuel? No, it's Second Samuel 24. In Second Samuel 24:1, it's God allowing David to do this. But in Chronicles, it's Satan. So we put them both together, and we have God allows Satan to put it in the heart of David to number the children of Israel, and everything is copacetic. So Chronicles understands Satan in a way that First and Second Samuel and First and Kings do not. The concept of Satan does not, they don't know it yet during the time of the monarchy at Israel. By the way, this helps me with some other things as well. So for example, there's a verse, is it in Exodus, where God says, I make people blind, I make people deaf. Well, I would much rather insert, I allow Satan to do these things, or I allow demons to do these things, or I allow nature to do these things. I allow nature to create viruses following the principles I've put into it. But what this suggests to me is that the agency of God at times is more indirect than the older parts of the Old Testament say, because the older parts of the Old Testament don't have this fuller understanding of how spiritual agency works. They only have a less precise. So it's true. It's not that the Old Testament is not true. It's just not as precise. Those of you who know science know that there's a difference between accuracy and precision. Accuracy means is it right or is it wrong? But precision means how is it within an inch? Is it within a tenth of an inch? What is the precision to where you're hitting? It's accurate. It's hitting the target, but sometimes it hits it in the bullseye, and sometimes it doesn't. And so the Old Testament doesn't hit it in the bullseye on some of these things, whereas the farther we get into the revelation, it comes closer to the bullseye. So the understanding of the Satan, I would argue, arises after Israel has come back from the captivity. Chronicles also has a priestly perspective, and so there's a great concern for matters of purity and that perspective. There's a priestly perspective that is key to Chronicles. And I already mentioned this, that Chronicles indicates that David wanted to build the temple, even designed it, but God didn't allow him to build it. Solomon builds the temple. And as I also mentioned, Solomon is less questionable in the presentation of Chronicles than he is in the presentation of Kings. Finally, I want to mention that in Chronicles, David becomes the principal king. This is understandable, that because Kings is reaching something like its final form around the time of Josiah, it makes sense that there would be an emphasis on Josiah in the Deuteronomistic history. And so you could argue that Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings have an element of them that highlights Josiah or alludes to possibly Josiah. In fact, I forget where it is. I think it's in First Kings, where Jeroboam receives a revelation about Josiah, hundreds of years before Josiah. And so it's understandable that the Deuteronomistic history, the former prophets, the early historical books, that they would focus more on Josiah because that's when they're arguably reaching their final form. But Chronicles, from a later perspective, from a post-exilic perspective, goes back to the fountainhead of the Davidic dynasty, and looks back to David as the primary focal king, which makes a lot of sense, I think. And of course, that's the way the New Testament will carry that forward as well. New Testament, as far as I can remember, doesn't really mention Josiah much at all, maybe not at all, but barely, if at all. I'm not even sure it does. David is clearly the bearer of kingship from the New Testament perspective. Well, this has been our video on 1st, 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles.